Chanty didn't know how long she had been talking to David. Now, her face was buried in the soft bed of the guest room. Night was approaching again, and another day would pass without seeing her father. Were all of David's words true? She didn't want to believe what David had told her, but seeing Jake confirmed that some of it was true. Her body felt weak, and she lacked the strength to move. What should she do? What could she do? How could she fight against beings with powers? She felt helpless. This was the depressing truth she realized about herself. Could she avenge what happened to her life and her father? She was also worried about Dr. Greg's family, feeling guilty about what happened to the doctor, who got involved in the situation. Chanty's father had kept many secrets from her. Now she understood why her parents had raised her the way they did. She remembered what David said about the eagle. What if one day she faced the eagle and David wasn't there to protect her? How would she defend herself? The Mondragons seemed unbelievable, like something out of a comic book, yet she couldn't understand why they targeted her. David hadn't explained why. What should she do? That day, she still hadn't seen Justin and Marco. They hadn't returned from wherever they went. The guest David was waiting for hadn't arrived either. She went to the bathroom, turned on the bathtub faucet, and undressed in front of the mirror. She stared at herself in the mirror. One of the things David mentioned was that the Mondragons needed her virgin blood because of their bloodlines, but she didn't know why. Were the Mondragons vampires? Why did they need her blood for what? What will happen to her once the Mondragons capture her? How long will she remain safe? How long will David stay by her side to protect her? These questions filled her mind, seeking answers. It seemed like there was no light waiting for her future. It was a mystery David hadn't explained, as they weren't sure either. It was awkward to discuss her virginity in front of men. She had grown up without having a boyfriend or male friends, but now her life had changed suddenly. How long would her life be safe? She bathed and soaked in the tub, not knowing how long she stayed there. Her mind was racing with thoughts, and her future seemed uncertain. She felt like a prisoner in her own life. Was she a prisoner now? Could she no longer do what she wanted? How long would she stay at David's house? What would happen to her life? She remembered David saying that she and Jake would leave when Justin arrived to watch over her while they went to the mansion. She felt like a child who needed constant supervision. She dreamed of turning 18 and being able to do what she wanted, but would that only remain a dream? She thought of her teacher who tutored her at home, wondering if they were looking for her and how they would react to the news about her home. The teacher was close to her. "What will happen to your life, Chanty? What will you do?" she whispered to herself, staring into the mirror, seeking answers to her chaotic thoughts. She stayed in the tub for a long time, then dressed in a long, silk one-shoulder nightgown she found in the cabinet. She learned that the room had once belonged to David's mother, which explained its elegance. The clothes in the cabinet were also bought by David's mother but had never been worn. She imagined David's mother lived a queenly life, judging by the luxurious items in the room. However, there were no photos of her, likely removed when the room was turned into a guest room. She felt sad for David's mother and the memories left for David and his siblings. She couldn't bear to think about the pain of witnessing their mother died. Chanty looked at herself in the mirror. The dress highlighted her figure and the blessings she had as a woman. She dried her hair with a blower when she heard a knock. It was Samuel, calling her for dinner. "I'll be right there, Samuel." "Thank you," Chanty replied. She raised her voice so that her answer could be heard, due to the room's vastness and the door's thickness, while continuing to dry her hair. She left her long hair down, not finding any hair ties or clips. She looked for a handkerchief to use as a hair tie. She couldn't find a handkerchief. There were only face towels and bath towels. Before she left the room, she saw on the wall clock that it was already 7:45 p.m. Does time fly that fast, she wondered, even though she knew she had woken up late at noon and had spent a long time talking with David. She felt as if she had no soul while walking. She feels like she's floating in the air. Could this be a result of the events in her life? She stopped briefly outside the bedroom door, her gaze falling on the angel carving on the door. She stared into its eyes. "What will happen to me now?" she whispered to the angel, questioning as if it were alive. She continued to stare at the door's carvings. It seemed alive to her, as if it's staring back. She closed her eyes briefly before continuing her walk to the dining area. As she walked, she glanced at the angel statues displayed along the hallway, wishing that angels truly existed. In her thoughts, she mused that if they were real, they would be like David, her savior and current guardian, although she didn't know for how long. She wasn't hungry, but since she was staying there, out of respect, she didn't want to trouble Samuel by making him come to invite her to eat again, and she didn't want her housemates, especially David, to worry about her. She hadn't even stepped out of the house that day to look around David's property. Despite feeling listless, she tried to cheer herself up before facing her housemates. Upon reaching the dining table, she found 9 people seated, all looking at her as if they were waiting for her. She was surprised by the number of people, as it had recently been just a few. Among those seated, she recognized David, Marco, Justin, and Jake, and there was a woman who seemed to be Arnold's age, one of their vineyard workers. She felt shy approaching because all their attention was on her. Although there was food on the table, they hadn't started eating yet. Was it because of her? Did they intentionally wait for her? The thought made her even more embarrassed. Had she taken too long to arrive since Samuel had called her? Everyone stood up and greeted her, which made her feel even more embarrassed. She almost wished she could sink into the floor at that moment. She tried her best to compose herself so that her embarrassment wouldn't be too noticeable. "Please forgive my late arrival. I didn't realize I was the only one being waited for." "Have you been waiting long, David?" "I'm sorry," Chanty said shyly while looking at David. "No, Chanty, in fact, our guests, along with Justin and Marco, have just arrived," David explained as he stood and took a chair prepared for her, making her feel even more awkward. "Please sit down so we can all eat together, and I'll introduce them to you," David said cheerfully. She sat down at the dining table and noticed Marco and Justin, like David, also had scratches and wounds on their faces and arms, especially Marco, who seemed to have taken the brunt of it. It appeared they understood Chanty's thoughts, so they just smiled and explained, "Don't worry about it, Chanty, we're okay," said Justin. "Let's eat, Chanty, and later we'll have a brief talk," Marco replied with a smile. Despite their injuries, their charm was not diminished. She still worried about them, knowing it was the result of what happened at the mansion. Were these people in front of her affected because of her? Had she suddenly become a responsibility to be watched over and cared for? Despite her troubled thoughts, she didn't want to give off a negative vibe, especially in front of David's food and guests. They all ate together that evening. Occasionally, she noticed that the 5 guests of David were staring at her intently, which made her feel uncomfortable, especially the 3 men who, she thought, were like David in social status. Undeniably handsome, with a commanding presence and, she noticed, long hair like Jake's. One had short hair and was particularly good-looking, the most handsome of all, she thought. This made her wonder, was David selective about the people he befriended? Did David have standards when it came to friendships? Did he not like unattractive people? Not that they were unattractive, just average-looking, she pondered. Did these men also possess powers? What kind of powers might they have? A flurry of questions played in her mind as she ate. She also noticed Jake, who was serious and silent, not even glancing her way since they began eating, his eyes fixed only on his food. She didn't take it the wrong way. One of the men with short hair spoke up, "David, why don't you start here and now by introducing us to Chanty? We know her, but she doesn't know us." "Isn't that unfair to her?" he said to David but looked at Chanty. He was slightly smiling, and his voice was deep, much like Jake's. Chanty looked at David, but all attention was on her. She wasn't surprised that they knew her. Life was indeed unfair, especially to her, she thought. She hoped the bitterness didn't show on her face, and that her feelings at that moment weren't apparent in her expression. "I was indeed planning to introduce you all to Chanty, but after we eat, so we won't be disturbed during our meal," David said reassuringly. "Don't worry, Jacob, now Chanty knows you," he added with a smile. While looking at Chanty and Jacob, Jacob responded to David with a chuckle. "Thank you, bro," Jacob said. "Nice meeting you, Chanty," he said, gazing at Chanty. "Same here, Jacob," Chanty replied formally. She thought to herself that the name suited him well. Jacob. Well, since Jacob has already started introducing himself, why don't we just continue? Let's not wait for David, joked another man sitting next to Jake. "I'm Gabriel," he said with a smile. Chanty looked at each guest with a smile, prompting them to introduce themselves one by one, while David seemed amused, listening to their exchange of introductions. The awkwardness between those eating dissipated due to their conversation, and the previously chilly atmosphere around them seemed to warm up. It's indeed more uncomfortable to face someone too formal, especially while eating. Chanty thought that, at least for the moment, she didn't feel as uneasy. Perhaps Jacob was the icebreaker. She noticed Jake was quiet, not laughing but also not frowning, seemingly deep in thought. She also observed that Justin noticed Jake's silence, catching Justin staring at Jake. At that moment, Chanty got to know David's guests, Jacob, Gabriel, and Luis. Another man was David's trusted manager for their vineyard and other properties, and the woman was Lorena, whom Justin and Marco had specifically hired to be her personal assistant. Chanty found David's thoughtfulness in providing her with a nanny is overwhelming. She didn't know how to express her gratitude to David, nor did she know how she could ever repay his kindness. She felt that David was perhaps providing her with more services than necessary. After eating, Marco invited Chanty to the living room, and Lorena, her new nanny, joined them. The others at the table watched them go. Soon after, Justin followed Chanty to the living room. Upon arriving, Chanty found numerous grocery bags. "All of this is for you, Chanty. Justin and I bought them, but Lorena chose them since they are women's items. If there's any brand or specific item you don't like, just tell Lorena, and we'll buy it," Marco said enthusiastically while looking at her. Chanty couldn't believe the siblings were doing this for her. She felt cared for and appreciated their effort. "You know, we trust Lorena because she was Mom's personal shopper before. She knows all about women's items, depending on your preferences. But don't worry, just tell us. This is only temporary while you can't go out yet. This will all pass, Chanty, and you'll be able to shop for what you want," Justin explained, glancing between Chanty and Lorena, while Lorena responded with a gentle smile. Chanty felt incredibly lucky to have such thoughtful siblings who knew exactly what to do without being told. She smiled and thanked them both. However, her eyes showed concern when she saw the bruises, cuts, and wounds on Marco and Justin's faces and arms. "Don't worry about our scratches and wounds, they're far from the bone. We've experienced worse," Marco said with a deep sigh, hands on his hips. "Lorena, you can take Chanty's things to the guest room. If anything's missing, just list it, Chanty, and we'll buy it," Marco instructed. Lorena began moving the items to the guest room. Left in the living room, Chanty looked again at a picture hanging on the wall. She approached and studied it closely, smiling at the sight of her father. She barely recognized him in his suit and different hairstyle, as he was much younger in the photo. "Yes, you've already recognized your father in that picture," Justin said with a smile, approaching her. Marco sat on the sofa, watching and listening to their conversation. "Marco really resembles your mom, Justin," Chanty commented with a smile. Chanty turned to Marco, who proudly nodded and gestured to his face, implying his good looks. Justin chuckled. "You're right, Chanty. That's what he always boasts about to us." Chanty felt awkward, not wanting their conversation to drift to the past, which might lead to unpleasant memories of their mother. She noticed Lorena had finished moving the groceries. "By the way, Chanty, we'll go horseback riding tomorrow," Justin suddenly changed the subject, lightening the mood. "David has many horses here in the stable near the forest. We know you're a good rider. Don Lorenzo always tells us when he visits our vineyard, even boasting that you might surpass our riding skills," Marco said with a laugh. Chanty laughed, surprised that they knew her so well before she had even met them at the mansion. "That's how parents are, their child is the best in everything," Chanty said modestly. Marco smiled at her playful joke. "I'm sorry about my behavior when you visited our house. You know. It wasn't a good first impression because it was the first time I saw you, Chanty apologized sincerely. Don't worry about it, Chanty. We understand. We were also surprised when we saw you because we didn't expect you to be so beautiful, Justin said straightforwardly, making her feel her cheeks blush. It was unusual for her to hear such compliments face to face, making her cheeks feel swollen, and she could only respond with a smile. Justin, stop it, you're making Chanty blush with what you're saying, Marco said with a smile. Sorry, Chanty, but I'm telling the truth. By the way, let's sit down, Justin invited, and they all sat on the sofa facing each other. Chanty saw the 5 men from the dining table approaching. Their gazes were different, especially Jacob's and Jake's. She thought about how her father raised her to avoid men, and now she was surrounded by them. Fate had a sense of humor, but thankfully, David and the others were kind and trusted by her father. She saw respect in the eyes of the men around her. She didn't fully know them yet, but she knew they were on the path to getting to know each other. Why had her life changed so suddenly? She didn't want a life dependent on others and hoped for a change. She would find out how. The 4 men sat down on the sofa, facing each other, while Jake stood apart, hands in his pockets, quietly observing them. David, I'll go ahead to the room and change, said Jake, staring at David. He didn't wait for David's response and turned away without glancing at his companions in front of him. David just looked at Jake and nodded. After Jake had left, Justin laughed and said, he's in one of his moods again, which made Marco and the others laugh too, except for Chanty. She had noticed that Jake had been showing a different mood lately. It seemed like he had mood swings, which she thought only women experienced. This made her smile to herself. Get used to Jake, Chanty. He can be like that sometimes, so annoying you want to punch him, but only sometimes, Justin joked. Jake is the kind of person who can stay silent all day. So don't be surprised, but when he's in a good mood, he's quite talkative, added Marco. Chanty noticed Jacob. His gaze was intense and somewhat disconcerting, similar to Jake's at times. His face was incredibly handsome, flawless, as if crafted by a perfect sculptor, she thought, but she didn't show that she was also amazed by his good looks. Were all the people around her like this? Is that why they looked at her that way? She thought David's group was really unique, as if David had a physical standard for friends. She didn't want to judge her friend for that. Maybe his friends were just naturally handsome. Her thoughts were deep, but she was waiting for David to leave so he could take care of the mansion and the body of her father and the others who perished there. Chanty, we're leaving now. We'll head to your place to take care of everything. Don't worry, I'll bring Robert with me. He'll oversee your vineyard temporarily until things return to normal, David said, glancing at Robert, his trusted companion. Robert nodded in response. I'll also bring Luis, he added, looking at Luis. The ones staying here will be Marco, Justin, Jacob, and Gabriel. David carefully considered each name he mentioned. The person in front of him listened silently. I'll capture videos and photos there, Chanty, so you can see, David said, his gaze fixed on her. Do you have any specific requests for me to address there? David asked, looking directly at Chanty. David, thank you so much. I wouldn't want to trouble you, as it's my responsibility, she said apologetically. Her feelings were a mix of embarrassment, concern, and fear. In truth, she didn't know what to say to David other than to express her gratitude. Her companions looked on in silence, empathizing with the events in her life. Don't worry, while we're away, don't stray far from the house, and don't go beyond the woods if you're going to ride horses, David said, looking at Justin. Chanty followed David's gaze to Justin. Why did it seem like David knew about Justin's plan to go horseback riding? Yes, sir. Don't worry, I know that, Justin replied to his brother with assurance in his voice. Jacob, Gabriel, you guys take care of things here, okay? David reminded them endlessly. Chanty thought, David is meticulous about every detail he wants to happen. He is indeed the boss of their entire group, judging by his authority and speech. The people David referred to nodded seriously and looked on.